Welcome back to the English Voice Club. Today, we're learning English through a captivating story. Get ready to improve your vocabulary and listening skills. Let's dive in. The air was thick with something unspoken, a weight that hovered in the corners of the room as if it were waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Julia had always known there was something different about her twin brother, Lucas, but she had never dared to question it. Not until tonight. She sat in the dimly lit room, eyes fixed on the old mirror that had stood in the corner of the room for as long as she could remember. It wasn't an ordinary mirror, no. It was large, antique, bordered with intricate patterns that seemed almost alive when you looked at them for too long. Lucas had always been fascinated by it, claiming it held secrets he could never explain. But Julia had always laughed it off. He was just her weird twin brother, always the one with strange ideas and even stranger stories. But something had changed. She could feel it now. As the clock ticked quietly in the background, the shadows in the room stretching and shifting like something was watching her. Just a few moments ago, she had been in the living room, chatting with her parents, when Lucas had casually mentioned something that made her stomach drop. He'd said it with that calm, casual tone he always used, as if it were nothing at all. "I've been living in the other world again," he'd said, as if he were simply talking about a trip to the store. The other world? What did that even mean? And then, like a sudden strike of lightning, it hit her. She wasn't just hearing things. Lucas had been disappearing, not for long, just for moments at a time. But there were gaps in his memory, strange things he couldn't explain. A look in his eyes when he returned from those odd disappearances that was too distant, too unfamiliar. She had dismissed it, convinced it was all in her head. But tonight, as he spoke of the other world again, everything clicked into place. Julia was not a foolish girl, despite the naivety she sometimes displayed. She had learned the art of reading people, the subtle hints in their posture, the brief pauses before they spoke, the way their eyes would flicker just before a lie. And Lucas's eyes had been flickering more than ever lately, just like they had now, staring at the old mirror with that unnerving focus of someone trying to communicate with something only they could see. "Lucas," Julia whispered, voice trembling, "what do you mean by the other world?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. She clenched her fists, trying to fight the panic that was rising within her. "No! Tell me what's going on!" Her voice was sharp, demanding, but deep down she feared the answer she might receive. She had always trusted Lucas, but now? The world felt as though it were unraveling, and she had no idea how to put it back together. I can't explain it, Julia," he murmured, stepping closer to the mirror. "But I need you to trust me." Her heart pounded in her chest. "Trust you? You're not making any sense. You're telling me you've been going to another world and you want me to trust you?" Lucas's eyes flickered again, and Julia noticed how his hands trembled slightly as they brushed against the glass. "It's real," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if confessing a dangerous secret. "I don't want to leave you behind, but I don't have a choice anymore." Julia stood up abruptly, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her mind raced. "Leave me behind? What does that mean? What do you mean you don't have a choice?" For the first time, she saw something in Lucas's eyes that terrified her. Fear. Real, unfiltered fear. It was so raw, so human, that it sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm not supposed to tell you this," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of whatever burden he had been carrying. "But I'm trapped, Julia. The world I'm in, it's not the same. It's not what you think." The words swirled around her head, each one making less sense than the last. Trapped? A parallel world? Was her twin brother truly losing his mind, or was something far worse going on here? "Please, I need you to understand," Lucas begged, his eyes pleading. "I'm not the same anymore. I can't be here, not fully. It's like I'm split between two places, and I don't know how much longer I can stay." Julia's throat tightened. She had to do something. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But what if it was? "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, barely able to process the enormity of what was unfolding before her. Lucas paused, his gaze turning distant once again as he stared into the mirror. "Find a way to reach me," he said softly. "Find a way to come to me. There's a door, a way, but you have to be careful. If you do it wrong, you might get stuck here forever, and I'll do it," Julia interrupted, her words tumbling out before she could stop herself. Her heart was racing, and a storm of emotions surged through her chest. Fear, determination, confusion, so many conflicting emotions that she couldn't separate them fast enough. "I'll find a way to reach you, Lucas. I promise." Her twin brother gave her one last haunting look. Then, without another word, he stepped closer to the mirror, his hand brushing against its surface. The glass seemed to ripple under his touch, like water disturbed by a stone thrown into it. For a brief moment, Julia thought she saw something on the other side. Shadows, shapes, and the faintest outline of what could only be a reflection of Lucas, but not quite the same. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. The room was empty, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the mirror's surface. Julia stood frozen, her mind reeling from the bizarre, terrifying reality she had just been thrust into. Her twin brother was living in another world, somewhere beyond this one, and he needed her to find a way to reach him. But how? And what would she find if she did? The answers were just beyond her reach. The air in the room felt colder now, the oppressive silence only broken by the faint hum of the clock. Julia stood in the same spot where Lucas had vanished, staring at the mirror, waiting for it to do something, anything that would explain what had just happened. She felt a dull ache in her chest, the realization sinking in that her brother was somewhere out there, in another world, a world that she couldn't even begin to comprehend. For a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all, but the thought of Lucas, alone in that other world, kept her upright. He needed her. She couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by confusion. She had promised him. She would find a way. Her mind raced. A door, Lucas had said. There was a way to reach him. But how? How could she step into a world she couldn't see, couldn't touch? The clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing in the quiet room. Suddenly the mirror seemed to shimmer again, just for a second, the reflection warping as if it were made of liquid. Julia took a hesitant step forward, drawn to the strange, almost magnetic pull of the mirror's surface. Her heart pounded as she reached out, fingers brushing against the glass. It felt cold, but it wasn't the same coldness she had felt before. It was deeper, unnerving. As her fingers made contact, the hum of the mirror grew louder, a sound like a faint whisper coming from the other side. For a moment, Julia froze. She couldn't breathe. Was it Lucas? Was he reaching out to her? "Julia," a voice called out, not from her brother, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere far beyond the glass. She jerked her hand back, heart racing. The voice was distorted. A strange echo that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't Lucas, but it sounded familiar. The panic surged again. She hadn't imagined it. Something, or someone, was on the other side. "Who's there?" Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. For a second, she thought she had imagined it, that it was just her mind playing tricks. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the voice returned, clearer this time, its tone desperate, pleading. "Help me." "Please, Julia." Her breath caught in her throat, the voice. It was Lucas, her twin brother's voice, but distorted, as though it were trapped in some unseen prison, desperate to break free. She could feel the urgency in every word, every breath. This wasn't just a message, it was a cry for help. Without thinking, she pressed her palm against the mirror again. This time, the surface rippled more violently, as if the mirror were alive, trying to break free from the constraints of its frame. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering in her chest, and pushed harder, hoping that the mirror would allow her to pass through to the other side, to reach Lucas. "Come on," she muttered to herself, tears welling in her eyes as she struggled to maintain her composure. She couldn't lose him, not again. "I'm coming for you. I won't leave you alone." The mirror shuddered under her touch, the surface now quivering like water in a storm. And then, as if it had been waiting for her to make this final decision, the glass seemed to dissolve into mist. A soft, silver glow radiated from the now empty space, the air around it charged with a strange energy. Julia felt a wave of dizziness, but she didn't hesitate. She took a step forward, one shaky foot after the other, until her entire body was standing in front of the mirror, her eyes fixed on the swirling fog. In an instant, she felt herself being pulled, her body yanked forward as if the mirror were a vortex, swallowing her whole. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and frantic in her ears. When Julia opened her eyes, the world around her was nothing like the one she had just left. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, like damp earth, and the air smelled different, thick, heavy, and saturated with a sense of mystery. The landscape stretched before her in every direction, barren and wild, with jagged cliffs and twisted trees. The sky was an unnatural shade of grey, swirling with faint clouds that seemed to shift and change with each passing moment. She stumbled backward, the reality of her surroundings sinking in. She was no longer in her room, no longer in her house, but somewhere far beyond, somewhere in a world that was both alien and familiar. It was as though she had stepped into a dream, one that she couldn't quite understand. "Lucas?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking louder would break the fragile silence around her. The wind howled in response, sending a chill down her spine. There was no answer. Her brother's voice had been so clear before, calling out for her, but now there was nothing. But Julia didn't have time to dwell on the silence. She had come here for a reason, and she wouldn't let fear or confusion stop her. Lucas was somewhere here in this strange world, and she had to find him. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes scanning the barren landscape. The fog swirled around her, and as she moved, she began to notice faint shapes emerging from the mist. Shadows that didn't quite match the contours of the land, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. It was as though the world itself was unstable, shifting with every movement she made. She had no idea where she was going, but her heart told her to keep moving. If Lucas was out there, she would find him. There had to be a way to reach him. The fog thickened, swirling around her in a way that made her feel as if she were walking through water, and as the mist parted for a brief moment, Julia caught a glimpse of something in the distance. It was faint but unmistakable, a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, facing away from her. "Lucas?" she called again, hope blooming in her chest despite the uncertainty that still gripped her. The figure didn't respond. It stood motionless, the wind tugging at its cloak, but there was something in its posture, something familiar. Her pulse quickened. This had to be him. It had to be. But as she took another step closer, the figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both Lucas and not Lucas. His eyes were the same, dark, filled with the same depth of emotion, but there was something different about them now. The warmth, the life that had once been there was gone, replaced with something colder, more distant. And then, in a voice that sent a shiver down her spine, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come, Julia." Julia stood frozen on the edge of the cliff, staring at the figure that resembled Lucas but wasn't quite him. The strange, distant look in his eyes sent a chill through her, like ice running through her veins. She had come here to rescue him, to pull him out of this world, but now she didn't know if she should be running from him instead. "You shouldn't have come, Julia," the figure said again, his voice low and raspy. It wasn't the voice of her twin brother. It was something darker. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, taking a step back. "I'm here to help you. You said you were trapped, and I won't leave you." The figure's lips curled into a faint, almost mocking smile. "Help me? You think you can help me? This world is not your world. Julia, it's not the same as yours. You have no idea what you're dealing with." His words echoed in her mind like an ominous warning. Julia's heart pounded harder in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she was sure of one thing. She couldn't let Lucas, this version of him, fall further into whatever nightmare this place had become. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The earth groaned and a low rumbling filled the air, like the land itself was waking up. Julia's pulse quickened as cracks appeared in the ground, spidering outward with frightening speed. She stumbled backward, losing her balance as the earth continued to tremble beneath her. What's happening?" she cried, scrambling to her feet. The figure that looked like Lucas didn't move, his gaze unwavering as the cracks in the earth spread. "It's not you they're after, Julia," he said, his voice now edged with a sense of finality. "It's him. He's the one they want. Before Julia could process the meaning of his words, the ground gave way beneath her. The world tilted and she was falling, the air rushing past her as the ground below seemed to vanish entirely. Panic surged through her body, her arms flailing as she tried to grab onto something, anything, to stop the fall. The mist around her thickened, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating shroud. Her body hit something hard. A sharp pain shot through her, and she cried out, her breath catching in her throat. But the fall wasn't over. She rolled, tumbling down what felt like a steep incline, crashing against jagged rocks as she went. Finally, the world stopped spinning, and Julia found herself lying in the dirt, bruised and breathless. She gasped for air, trying to gather her bearings, but the world around her was spinning in strange, dizzying patterns. The sky above was black, dotted with shifting clouds that seemed to pulse like something alive. The landscape was jagged and alien, with tall, twisted trees that appeared to be made of metal, their limbs bent and knotted in impossible shapes. Julia sat up slowly, wincing as the pain in her body flared up. She could barely see through the dense fog that clung to the air, but she knew she wasn't alone. She could hear them, footsteps, low and deliberate, moving through the mist. Her heart skipped a beat. A figure emerged from the fog, tall and imposing, wearing what appeared to be a cloak made of living shadows. Its face was obscured, but the sound of its voice was unmistakable, low, raspy, and filled with an unsettling calmness. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice dripping with malevolence. "Now you've awakened them." Julia's breath caught in her throat as another figure emerged, and then another. They appeared one by one, their forms indistinct and shifting as though they were made of smoke. The air grew colder as they gathered around her, their presence oppressive as though they were waiting for her to make a mistake. "Who are you?" Julia asked, trying to steady her trembling voice. "What do you want with me?" The shadowed figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing faintly from beneath the hood. "You've come seeking answers," it said, the words slow and deliberate. "But answers are not what you will find here." Julia's mind raced. These figures, were they the ones Lucas had warned her about? Had she awakened them by stepping into this world? "What do you mean?" she demanded. "I'm looking for my brother! He's trapped here! I need to find him!" The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words. "Your brother is not your concern," it said. "Not anymore. It is you who has disturbed the balance, Julia. You who have broken the rules." A cold wave of dread washed over her. What balance? What rules? The questions bubbled in her mind, but the figure's words felt final, like a sentence she couldn't escape. Suddenly there was a loud crash, and the figures scattered. The earth beneath Julia's feet rumbled again, but this time it wasn't just the ground shifting. Something larger was coming, something that moved with terrifying force, shaking the very foundation of the world around her. She turned and saw it. Massive, dark shapes emerging from the mist. They were huge, more like beasts than creatures, with thick, muscular bodies and eyes glowing red. Their claws scraped the ground as they moved, tearing through the fog with a relentless hunger. Julia's breath hitched in her throat. She had to move, had to run. But the world around her was closing in, and the creatures were coming faster than she could react. Her feet felt heavy, like the earth itself was trying to drag her back into its depths. Suddenly she heard a voice that was strangely familiar. "Julia! Run!" She turned and saw a figure emerging from the mist. It was Lucas, her brother, but not the same one she had seen before. His eyes were wild, his face grim, and he was moving quickly toward her, his hands outstretched. "Lucas!" she cried, relief flooding her chest. But then she saw the creatures closing in, their eyes locked on her and the ground trembling beneath them. "Go!" Lucas shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the trees. "I'll hold them off, but you have to leave. Now!" "Leave? I can't leave you!" Julia protested, struggling against his grip. "Do you want to save me?" Lucas snapped. "Then go! Find a way to close the gate, or we're both doomed." Julia's heart shattered at his words. He was right. If she stayed, they both would perish. She nodded, fighting back tears, and with one last look at her brother, she turned and ran. The creatures were gaining on her, their roars filling the air, but Julia didn't dare look back. She pushed herself harder, faster, her body screaming in protest as she ran through the thick fog, her mind racing with the terrifying knowledge that this was only the beginning. There were dangers here, real dangers. But now there was something worse than the creatures. There were enemies, yes, but there were also those who had helped her, and Lucas was one of them. She had to find the way to close the gate before this world swallowed them both whole. The fog was thick, almost suffocating, but Julia didn't dare stop. Her legs were on fire and her breath came in short, ragged gasps, but the roar of the creatures chasing her pushed her forward. She could hear their claws scraping the ground, the heavy thudding of their steps reverberating through the air. She had no idea how far she had run or how long she could keep this up, but there was no choice. She had to get to the gate. If she could just find it, maybe there was still time to close it, to save Lucas, to save them both. Her heart was pounding in her chest, each beat a loud drum in her ears. The fog seemed endless, like a living thing closing in around her, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. She stumbled over a rock, barely catching herself before falling face first into the dirt, but she didn't stop. Not yet. Her mind raced. Where was the gate? It had to be close. She couldn't afford to waste time to second-guess herself. Lucas's warning echoed in her mind. If you want to save me, close the gate. But how? How could she close something she barely understood? This place, this world, it was like nothing she'd ever imagined. There were no answers, only dangers, only shadows. Suddenly she heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Julia," she froze. Lucas's voice. "Where are you?" she screamed, her voice hoarse with desperation. Her throat burned and her heart was racing faster than ever. She knew she couldn't afford to stop, but she had to know. Had he come after her? Was he okay? Another voice broke through the fog, this one distorted and menacing. "She's too far gone." Julia's blood ran cold. She spun around, but she couldn't see anyone through the thick mist. The figures from before, the shadowed beings that had surrounded her earlier, they were here. She could feel their presence. But they were not alone. The air around her shifted and suddenly the ground trembled again. The beast-like creatures were back, closer than ever. Their low growls vibrated the air and their eyes glowed through the fog like embers. They were closing in. She had no more time. With a sharp intake of breath, Julia pushed forward again, her thoughts blurring, the fear and adrenaline driving her every step. But the ground beneath her feet was treacherous, slippery, uneven, and before she could stop herself, her foot twisted at an odd angle. Pain shot through her ankle, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to let it slow her down. She couldn't stop. Not now. She blinked against the fog, squinting as she caught sight of a shape emerging from the mist, a figure, tall, imposing, and unmistakably familiar. It was Lucas. She rushed toward him, calling his name. "Lucas! It's me! I found you! I'm here!" But as she reached out for him, something changed. The figure of Lucas began to blur, the edges of his form dissolving into the mist, his face twisting into something unrecognizable. It was him, but it wasn't. The transformation was happening before her eyes, as if the very world around her was rejecting him. The shadows that had been chasing her had caught up, and now they swirled around him, pulling him away from her. "Don't touch him," a voice called from behind. Julia turned, and her blood ran cold when she saw the shadowed figure, no longer just a shape, but a towering creature with glowing eyes and a face that was almost human. "What's happening?" Julia shouted, backing away. Her hands were shaking, but she clenched her fists, trying to gather her strength. "What do you want from us?" The creature stepped closer, its footsteps heavy, and its voice rumbled low like distant thunder. "He was never meant to be here. Neither were you." The fog began to twist, swirling violently around them. Julia's heart raced as the creature's eyes fixed on her, its gaze cold and calculating. "You're too late," it said, almost mocking her. "The gate is already closing. You can't stop it." Julia's chest tightened. The gate, was that what had happened? Had she somehow triggered the end of it all? A flash of movement caught her eye. Lucas, no, the version of him that had been taken over by the shadows, was now fully engulfed by them. His body contorted, his form flickering between the man she knew and something darker, his face twisted into a snarl. "No!" Julia cried, her voice hoarse. "I won't leave you here." The shadowed figure tilted its head, studying her with an almost sinister curiosity. You are a part of this, Julia. You always have been. You're just as much a part of this world as he is. Julia could feel the weight of the creature's words settle around her. She wasn't just in a parallel world. She had been pulled into it for a reason, and that reason was Lucas. But if that was true, what could she possibly do to save him now? You think you can change it, the creature sneered. You're a part of the chaos here, just like him. Panic surged in her chest, and in that moment everything clicked. The gate, the creatures, the shadows. It wasn't just about crossing from one world to another. The world itself was being consumed. Lucas had been dragged here, but he wasn't the only one. The entire world was under threat, and she was the only one who could stop it. Then I'll stop it, Julia whispered, her voice trembling but firm. I'll close the gate, and I'll save him. The figure laughed, a low, cruel sound. You think you have the power to do that? Julia took a step forward, feeling something inside of her shift, a sense of clarity she hadn't known before. The power wasn't in the gate, it was in her. It always had been. She had to let go of her fear, her doubt. She had to take control. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness of her mind she saw it, the gate, the swirling energy, the rip between the worlds. And with a single thought, a single pulse of will, she reached out. Everything shook. The air crackled with power, and the world around her groaned as if it were being torn in two. The creature howled in frustration, but Julia didn't falter. She focused, pulling the energy together, forcing the gate to close. And then silence. The ground beneath her steadied. The fog began to lift, the oppressive weight of the world around her fading. She opened her eyes, and there, standing before her, was Lucas. His face was calm, his eyes no longer filled with shadows. Julia, he whispered, his voice hoarse but real. You did it. You saved me. She reached for him, her heart soaring with relief. But as their hands met, she realized that this world, this strange, twisted place, was beginning to fade. The battle had been won, but the cost was high. I couldn't have done it without you, Julia whispered, her voice breaking. I never could have. And as the world around them crumbled, they stepped forward together, knowing that no matter where they were, whether in this world or another, nothing could ever break their bond. They were stronger than the shadows. They were together. The world around them had stopped shaking. The fog, thick and oppressive only moments before, had lifted, revealing a sky that was now clear and pale blue. Julia stood still for a moment, her body trembling with the after effects of the confrontation. The silence was deafening. The air felt lighter now, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like ages, she was able to breathe without that constant pressure in her chest. She looked around, half expecting the creatures, the shadows, to reappear, but they were gone. Everything had shifted. The world was no longer the place of constant danger and confusion it had been just moments ago. Lucas stood beside her, his expression soft and searching, his hand still gripping hers. They hadn't said much since the gate had closed, but there was a quiet understanding between them. A shared bond. They had fought through the impossible, faced the unknown together, and now they stood at the edge of something new. The world that had been falling apart was now eerily calm. You did it, Lucas whispered, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. I can't believe it. We're really out of it. Julia nodded, her throat tight. It was hard to find the words. There was so much that had happened, so much that had changed. But in the end, they had done it. They had defeated the shadows, closed the gate, and saved each other. But now there was only the quiet aftermath. The air felt fresh now, almost serene. Still, the landscape around them had changed. The island that had once been overrun with dangerous forces was now empty. The only sounds came from the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of birds. We're safe, Julia said, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. For so long they had been fighting for survival, not knowing if they'd make it out. Now it was done. They had survived. Safe, Lucas repeated, looking around in disbelief. His voice trailed off as he gazed at the horizon. The sense of finality in his tone made Julia's chest tighten again. It was hard to believe that the fight was over, that everything they'd been through had brought them to this point. She squeezed his hand tighter, as though grounding herself in the reality of it. We're free, she said softly. But the freedom didn't feel as light as it should have. The silence was comfortable, yes, but there was still the shadow of what had happened hanging over them. The journey they had been on was far from ordinary. They had faced unimaginable creatures, lost part of themselves in the process, and now, in the calm that followed the storm, Julia couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still missing. "How did you know it would work?" Lucas asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Julia looked at him, her brow furrowing. "I didn't," she admitted. "I had no idea. I just felt it. I knew I had to try. And when the moment came, I realized I wasn't just trying to save you. I was saving both of us." Lucas nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "You've always been the stronger one, haven't you?" Julia smiled, but it wasn't a happy one. "I don't know about that," she replied, her voice quiet. "I've just had to be." "You weren't the only one who needed saving." He reached for her then, pulling her into a hug. It was the first time in what felt like forever that they held each other without the constant threat of danger looming over them. And as they stood there in the soft embrace of the cool, open air, Julia realized how much they had both changed in the short time they had been in this world. The bond between them had only grown stronger, and now there was no more doubt. They were survivors. They were different people from the ones who had stumbled into this world, unsure of their purpose and their place. As they pulled away from the embrace, the sounds of the world around them started to settle into a peaceful rhythm. The creatures that had once filled the air with terror were gone. The mist that had shrouded everything had dissipated. The world was quieter, but there was still something unsettling about it. They had closed the gate, yes, but the consequences were far-reaching. "Do you think it's really over?" Julia asked, her voice small but uncertain. Lucas looked at her, his expression serious. "I think we're far from done." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "This world, it's not just going to forget what happened. We've changed things, but I believe we've also made a difference, and we can't undo that." She nodded, processing his words. There was no going back to how things were before. They had altered the course of everything, and now they were the ones who had to live with that knowledge. But even with the uncertainty lingering, there was something comforting in the fact that they had done it together. "I just hope it's worth it," Julia said softly, her eyes searching the horizon. "All of it." "It has to be," Lucas replied, his voice steady but with a hint of hope. "We've made it this far, together." Julia smiled at him, feeling the weight in her chest slowly lift. They weren't the same people they had been when they first arrived in this world. They had grown. They had faced the darkest of challenges, and now they had something more precious than anything they had ever known, each other. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land, Julia and Lucas stood side by side. The threat had been quelled, the gate closed, and the world seemed, for now, peaceful. But even in this calm, there was a knowing between them, a recognition that life was never truly still. There would always be challenges, always be trials, but they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they would face it. And no matter where they went from here, Julia knew one thing for certain. They had survived the impossible, and they were stronger for it. The silence around them felt different now. No longer a threat, but a promise of peace. A promise that, whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The days following the closing of the gate were filled with a strange kind of calm. Julia and Lucas stayed close to each other, their footsteps marking the once chaotic ground with a new purpose. The island, now freed from its haunted grip, was quiet, still, but the weight of the unknown still lingered. They had fought through everything, and yet the journey was far from over. The horizon stretched wide before them, and though it was beautiful, the sense of finality wasn't immediate. The world around them had changed, but there was still the haunting question that lingered in Julia's mind. Had they truly fixed everything? Had their actions really sealed the fate of the strange creatures, the eerie mists, and the gate they had shut? They had saved each other, but could they live with the aftermath? They walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps the only disruption to the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. A breeze stirred the leaves in the trees, and the birds that had long been silenced by the supernatural chaos now began to return, singing sweetly in the cool air. The sight of the island, now bathed in light, gave Julia some comfort. Yet her mind never stopped racing. Lucas broke the silence, as he always did when the quiet got too thick. Do you ever wonder if things will ever really go back to how they were? Julia glanced at him, and for a moment she didn't know how to answer. I don't think they can, she said softly. We've changed. This whole place has changed. It's not the same world we came to. That's true, Lucas said, his voice a little distant, his eyes fixed on the horizon. But that doesn't mean it's over. We've put things back in place for now. Who knows what might come next? Julia's heart tightened. He was right. They hadn't completely erased the consequences of their actions, but they had given themselves a chance. And for the first time, Julia realized that, despite all the chaos and loss, they had made it, together. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. What was next? They had nothing left to fear, at least not from the creatures that had once lurked in the shadows. But would they ever truly escape the memories of what had happened here? Days turned into weeks. The world, now settling, had returned to its rhythms. Julia and Lucas explored the island together, finding remnants of the past hidden beneath the rubble. They discovered strange markings on the ground, cryptic symbols that spoke of an older time, and relics from a world that had once been full of life. It felt like the island was revealing its secrets, slowly giving up pieces of its forgotten history. One afternoon, as they sat on a cliff's edge overlooking the ocean, Lucas turned to Julia. His expression was unreadable, but she could feel the weight of his words before he even spoke them. You know, I think we're going to be okay, he said quietly. Julia looked at him, surprised by the sudden shift in his tone. What do you mean? I mean, we've been through hell, Julia, and look at us. We're still standing, together. Her heart skipped a beat. The statement was simple, but it was true. They had come so far, from the moment the gate opened, to the fierce battle against the creatures, to the moments of fear and loss. And yet, here they were, surviving, together. The feeling of deep connection swept over her, and she couldn't help but smile. It was bittersweet, this feeling of realization. They had accomplished so much, and yet the end of this chapter felt so sudden. The world they had fought for was here, quiet and peaceful, but they weren't entirely sure what to do with it yet. Lucas stood up, brushing the sand off his pants, and turned to face her fully. You know, if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't fought with me, I don't think I could have done it. Julia's heart fluttered. She didn't have the words for what she was feeling. The loss, the terror, the danger, it all seemed impossible to survive. But in the end, their strength had pulled them through. And now, as they stood together in the aftermath, there was a sense of peace, a fragile calm. She finally spoke, her voice steady but soft. We're both here because of each other. We fought for our lives and we survived. We're alive because we didn't give up. He smiled then, a small, genuine smile that made her heart warm. I guess we're stronger than we thought. The horizon, once so intimidating and filled with uncertainty, now seemed like a promise. The future stretched out before them, waiting for them to take the next step. Julia thought about everything they'd been through, the long hours of fear, the terrifying moments when they didn't know if they would survive, and the rare moments of peace where they found each other amidst the chaos. They had built something here, something that transcended just surviving. It was a bond. And with it, they were ready for whatever came next, but there was still one last question. What do we do now? Julia asked quietly, looking up at Lucas. Lucas seemed to consider it for a moment, and then he looked at her, his eyes steady. We rebuild, we go forward. Whatever this world holds, we'll face it together and we'll make it better. His words echoed in her chest. Together, she whispered. They stood there for a long moment, the ocean breeze flowing gently around them. The world felt calmer now. The storm was over and the sky was clear. There would be challenges ahead, new paths to walk and unknown forces to face. But they were ready. They had each other. Julia realized that their journey had changed her. She had always been someone who ran from fear, someone who preferred to protect herself from pain. But here, on this island, she had learned the value of not giving up. She had learned that survival wasn't just about making it through, it was about living through it, holding on to the people who mattered and never letting go. And with Lucas by her side, she felt ready for whatever came next. They turned away from the cliff, walking toward the unknown future. side by side.